Thank you, everybody, for joining this webinar hosted by CNCA and the Barcelona Lab for environmental and climate justice. We are very happy to be presenting today a resource that was recently completed around our built environment work in Europe, helping to bring equity and climate justice to lenses to the work that we've been conducting in Europe for several years now, helping cities to tackle embodied emissions in the built environment as they've progressed through their kind of technical capacity to approach embodied emissions. We've found it ever relevant and important to help contextualize these new policies in the social and justice and climate justice context. So we have a few presenters who are going to dive in for us into the resource, which highlights and daylights the structural inequalities in the built environment in 3 cities, in Glasgow, Nantes, and Barcelona as case studies, but also panning out to the national level in each of those contexts. So we are very happy to have with us Emilia Oshchiwovic, who's a doctoral researcher at the University of Colorado in Denver, and an affiliated researcher with the Barcelona Lab for Urban Environmental Justice and Sustainability. Her research focuses on equitably planning for climate change and disaster by advancing policies, tools, and interventions that contribute to just, affordable, and climate-resilient neighborhoods. We also have Melissa Garcia-Lamarca, is an assistant professor at the Center for Sustainability Studies at Lund University in Sweden, and an affiliated researcher with the Barcelona Lab for Urban Environmental Justice and Sustainability. Her research focuses on housing justice, the financial and real estate dimensions of urban green inequalities, and housing decarbonization. Melissa is a co-founder and editorial collective member of the Radical Housing Journal. And we have also Lisa Hanushki, who holds a Bachelor of Science in Earth and Environmental Sciences from the University of Freiburg in Germany, and a Master of Science in European Studies from Bauhaus University in Weimar. She's currently affiliated also with the Barcelona Lab within the Universitat Autónoma de Barcelona as a researcher in the project Gender Inclusive Adaptation for a Changing Climate, examining gendered housing vulnerability and displacement in the metropolitan area of Barcelona. Her research interests include social injustice and displacement in the city, especially in the context of climate urbanism and sustainably oriented urban renewal. So thank you, Emilia, Lisa, and Melissa for joining us. I will pass right away to our first presenter, Emilia. So please, Emilia, take it from here.
Hi, everyone. I'm Emilia Oshchiwovic. Thanks for joining us today. I'm going to start with a little bit of a context to the report more generally, and then starting with who we are at the BCNUEJ lab in Barcelona, and then moving towards what was the intentions and objectives of the report and how we did the report, conducted that research. And then we'll move into those case studies, Barcelona, Glasgow, and Nantes. We'll run through, and then we'll have Q&A at the end. So certainly hold your questions, or please add them to the chat. And I think Tracy will be monitoring that, so we'll definitely get to them. So yeah, at the BCNUEJ lab, we are a group of researchers from many different disciplines and backgrounds: urban planning, public policy, sociology, geography, public health. We came together to really center around similar questions of structural and systemic drivers of inequality in urban spaces, particularly those that are related to environmental and climate justice. And today, this project that BCNUEJ supported and really led here alongside CNCA is this work on the built environment, climate justice, and how Europe is facing those challenges while also navigating these deep structural inequalities. And this is kind of the main framework that we pursued this work through, most specifically through housing, labor, migration, race, and access to urban resources. So this report, again, really focuses on Barcelona, Nantes, and Glasgow. And we didn't select these cities by any means because they are worst case studies, but rather because they are truly leaders in this work. They're addressing climate justice through the built environment while also navigating these deep structural inequalities that exist in each framework across the globe, really. So the objectives of this report, we asked three central questions. How have dynamics of oppression created a legacy of intersectional inequalities and exclusion that prevent or constrain cities from addressing climate justice locally? How are municipal, public, and civic actors working to overcome them in planning and policy? And then which innovative tools or practices can support those actors moving forward? And to answer these questions, we conducted empirical and novel research. We first reviewed existing policy and planning documents at the local, regional, and national level for each of the case studies. And we also reviewed existing publicized research, rather, related to housing and climate action and housing and climate justice as well. And then after developing the context for each of these case studies, we turned towards conducting novel and empirical, again, interviews with planners, policymakers, and activists who are in these spaces in each of the cities, and those who also work more at the national levels. We really wanted to ask them, how are the manifestations of these inequalities, those being structural, how did they emerge in the practice of their own work, and how did they manifest, and what did they look like? So a key argument that we really make throughout this report, I think that's important to understand, is that we argue that climate justice cannot be understood separately from housing justice and also from economic justice. And in many European cities, climate policy is unfolding in contexts where multiple crises are happening at once, forming a polycrisis, point 4 here in this figure. This polycrisis is further intensified by compounding structural inequalities, which I'll go on to define, which are leading to an overwhelm of local and national housing policy and planning systems. And throughout this report, we use the concepts of systemic oppression and systemic inequalities and structural inequalities, by which we mean that oppression and inequality is embedded in institutions, policies, markets, planning systems, etc. It's reproduced in those housing markets, and it leads to decisions that are impacting individuals who are vulnerable or at risk. So ultimately, this report is interested in a singular tension. How can cities pursue climate action without deepening the very inequalities that make residents vulnerable to climate harm in the first place? So I'll turn to Barcelona, which is the first case in the report, and this is kind of the structure of how we'll go through each of the case studies. A review of the context of each case study, and then onto what we found from interviews. So Barcelona, maybe many of us have been to each of these cities or live in these cities, but Barcelona is a particularly important case study for the impacts of tourism and how those have impacted existing housing markets for long-term residents. It is really known for policies like the Superblock, which is an intervention for traffic calming intended to support climate mitigation and adaptation in neighborhoods. It is well known also for investments in public space and efforts to expand urban greening throughout the city. At the same time, Barcelona is also one of Europe's most visible examples of housing pressures and tourism-driven displacement. We found in our reviews of different literatures and through talking with other people that there are specific groups most impacted in Barcelona, those being migrants and racialized groups, women, and especially migrant women, and low-income households or those with fixed incomes, and also the elderly and those living with disability. Several critical laws and policies we find have impacted the historical trends of housing and the built environment in Barcelona. So first, though, that being the mortgage interest deduction, which existed from 1978 to 2013 and provided tax benefits for homeownership. And over this time, this helped reinforce Spain's strong ownership-oriented housing model. But during the 2000s, particularly the 2008 housing bubble, this model was also linked to mortgage abuses and speculative real estate dynamics, which deepened housing insecurity for many households, particularly those already most vulnerable to economic changes. Second, the Ley de Extranjería of 2000, Spain's immigration law, which ties residence and work permits to formal employment contracts. This particularly impacts, again, those migrants who are excluded from formal labor markets and formal rental markets. So without those stable contracts, residents may be pushed into more informal housing arrangements, often living in overpacked, overly dense, often temporary leases, and overall very precarious living situations. And then third, the Ley 15, 2022, the Integral Law for Equal Treatment and Non-Discrimination, which expanded protections against racial and ethnic discrimination in housing. But from talking with folks, our findings suggest that these protections are often violated and are often difficult to implement and maintain, particularly for those migrants and residents who are non-Spanish speaking. They still face discrimination when trying to access housing and legal protections and do not always translate to enforceable rights in the everyday rental market. Then finally, this last ley that we have, Ley por el Derecho a la Vivienda of 2023, this most recent one, which is Spain's first national housing law at the national level. This represents an important shift towards recognizing housing as a right, but again, it's really difficult to maintain and to regulate and to implement throughout each region of Spain. We've then identified three major manifestations of the inequalities, and that's again drawn directly from those interviews that we conducted. So starting with housing, particularly for migrants, tenants, and those non-Spanish speaking residents often face discrimination in the rental market. These include precarious contracts, informal rental arrangements, higher rents for the same units. This is happening in a city, Barcelona, where only 1.7% of housing is socially protected, which means that most residents are exposed to this private rental market. And the interviews make clear that migrant tenants are often pushed into the most insecure parts of that rental market. One respondent explained that informal rental arrangements are much more common for non-Spanish speaking tenants, and this leaves people unprotected and vulnerable to predatory landlords. Temporary leases and room rental contracts are particularly important here because they often fall outside stronger tenant protections. Barcelona is also facing increased heat risks, as many cities across Europe are, even today being one of those increased heat risk days. These risks, of course, are unevenly distributed across people and across those who are more vulnerable, those groups we've already mentioned. Those dense central neighborhoods, such as the Raval and Trinitat Nova, often combine dense housing, limited ventilation, fewer green spaces, and lower household resources for adapting to heat. Those neighborhoods you can see here are circled in red and then squared in red in the upper right of this figure, which comes from the Metropolitan Agency of Barcelona. These neighborhoods are incredibly at risk and, of course, again, don't have the capacity to adapt to these high-risk heat days. Finally, Barcelona's economy is also heavily shaped by tourism and the service sector work and those who are working in those industries related to tourism. So many workers are concentrated in precarious jobs with weak labor protections, often exposed to higher heat days or just otherwise greater environmental exposure, and also higher commuting costs as they have to travel into city centers if they live more towards the peripheries of the cities, which often have, of course, lower housing costs. And moreover, Barcelona's housing market is often has been reshaped by short-term rentals, mid-term rental contracts, investor demands, and the broader role of the city as an international destination. And one important point from the report that we make is that mid-term rentals, this is what we heard from folks working in this housing space, those leases longer than 30 days but less than 1 year seem to be able to function as a loophole outside of all of the lays that I've already discussed, that they are not exactly tourist rentals, but they're not exactly standard long-term leases. And this gives landlords flexibility and the opportunity to raise rents, remove tenants, and avoid those stronger tenancy protections that are intended to protect those people most vulnerable. And after identifying in the report these manifestations of inequality, we move towards trying to identify also what those promising opportunities are that people are, both activists and policymakers and planners, are implementing in order to really focus on these promising strategies. So one important area that Barcelona is really looking forward to and integrating is this role of cooperative and nonprofit housing models. So groups such as the Social Civic, La Dinamo, are working with ethical and cooperative banking co-ownership models, where tenants also are participating in the ownership of units, much like a community land trust. And these models are important because they effectively remove housing from speculative markets, of course, and then create more stable and collectively owned housing units that are also maintained. Of course, this also produces supportive, emotional bonds with the housing and with neighbors. So all around, this is revealing itself to be a really contributive, I guess, way to approach housing. And a second promising opportunity is activist and political pressure on the municipalities to purchase under-maintained apartment buildings. So those being the city of Barcelona, or even the metropolitan agencies of Barcelona, or even the cities surrounding. Again, removing housing from speculative markets, and having more, of course, publicly owned housing. So those are just a couple of the promising opportunities. I will hand it over now to Melissa, who is on the case study for Glasgow.
Thank you, Amelia. So yes, turning to Glasgow, this is also a city that's been very active in taking action around climate change. They have a very ambitious climate plan, which was released in 2021. And maybe you remember came kind of rose in this scene of acting on climate, also in hosting the COP in 2021. But I think it's really important to start talking about Glasgow and the crucial role housing has played in terms of structural inequalities that are intimately related to questions of climate justice. It's important to say this was not always the case, because after World War II, housing was very central in building the social democratic welfare regime across the United Kingdom. And by the 1960s, the city of Glasgow was the largest social landlord in Europe. So up to 63% of the population in Glasgow lived in social rental homes owned by the city council. So this was quite a remarkable moment in the history of Glasgow. And then the period when Margaret Thatcher came to power in the 1970s, and there was a unrolling of neoliberal policies, there was a massive change unfurled that's very evident today still in terms of the state withdrawal from welfare provision and also mass industrialization across the UK. So this really leads us to this first very foundational inequality around public housing being privatized, which happened through two mechanisms in the UK and in Glasgow. The first was this right to buy scheme where social tenants in public housing could purchase their home. And the second was in the case of Glasgow, 2002, the stock transfer of council housing, where the city council sold these properties. They were taken over by housing associations. So housing associations are nonprofit organizations, but their day-to-day activities are funded by rent and service charges. So in this sense, they operate with the same logic as commercial entities. So this closely connects to the next inequality in the slide you can see around under-maintained and poor quality housing and energy poverty. So essentially, there's been insufficient investment in improving housing quality, and that's left a lot of low-income tenants exposed to cold, damp, and high energy bills. Another important inequality dimension is around transport, where peripheral communities have been poorly serviced by public transit. So in general, in Glasgow, the working class lack adequate and equitable transportation, and this has been impacting islands of economic poverty that's been compounded by the privatization of transportation systems. The final inequality dimension on the slide is very connected to the first and second, stagnant salaries and the rise of the cost of living. So Glasgow was known as quite an affordable city, but private sector rents in particular have been skyrocketing, which I'll touch on again. The most impacted groups we found in our research were low-income households who are overrepresented in poor quality housing and have been struggling with rent increases and energy poverty. Migrants and asylum-seeking populations. Glasgow was designated as a no-choice dispersal city for asylum seekers over a decade ago, and they've been placed in poor quality rental housing There's also been a growing unhoused population in Glasgow over the past 10 years. Finally, we also saw that women and caregivers are most impacted, especially around transport systems that have been designed for commuter patterns to regular work hours and not around care responsibilities that often women and caregivers are responsible for. And some of these laws at the end of the slide, you can see, have been impacting these, have shaped these inequalities that I've described. Next slide, Amelia, please. So going through the same structure that Amelia did, how these inequalities are manifesting in Glasgow in relation to climate change. So again, I have three to highlight here. In our research, we found high housing-related vulnerability in terms of climate change impacts and social inequalities. So the decades of privatization and disinvestment in housing, which since 1998, it falls under the powers of the Scottish Government and the City of Glasgow, the City Council. This has meant that housing maintenance and retrofit is not at the level it should be. So the insufficient amounts of retrofit affect tenants in particular. So at the moment, good quality retrofits are benefiting high-income groups because demand-side schemes are expensive. So essentially, if people don't own their homes, they can't access government support to increase energy efficiency. And tenants that are renting, there's not a lot of incentives for landlords to retrofit. As noted in the quote here on this slide, after the 2007 Grenfell Tower fire in London, where the external cladding caused the fire to spread extremely rapidly and killed 70 residents, there's been a UK-wide mandate to have all the cladding removed from buildings across the country, but a lot of that work still has not taken place. So on the bottom left of this screen here, you see a screenshot from the Scottish Housing News that shows the government has started to provide funding to assess properties in 2025. And this is just an assessment for all residential properties in Scotland. In seeking more climate-friendly housing to meet larger carbon reduction goals, Glasgow developers and the City Council have increasingly turned to demolition and redevelopment of existing older tenement blocks on council-owned land. So this is a photo from Sighthill, but just recently in the Winford estate was demolished. And this has generated a lot of conflicts between local residents and local groups around whether to demolish or whether to retrofit existing buildings in terms, of course, of the environmental impacts, so the embodied carbon of new build housing, and also the social impacts, so the displacement of residents when these demolitions take place. Next slide, Amelia, please. So there are excellent examples that are worth noting of, this is especially of how tenement housing in Glasgow, these are the kind of very emblematic 3 or 4 story sandstone properties that are across Scotland and Glasgow, how these can be retrofitted. So this was a pilot project to retrofit a pre-1919 tenement, and it was a collaboration between a range of actors, including the City Council, the Southside Housing Association, a university research team, architects and builders. So they aim to reduce energy use by 70 to 90% in this project, which they achieved. The question now is really how to fund, finance, and scale up these retrofits in an equitable way. Next slide, please. So the stock transfer and right to buy, as I explained before, has fundamentally shaped structural inequalities in Glasgow. So you can see this quote from the tenant union, at the second one there, says that Glasgow has always been a working class city. It's always been affordable, but this was really profoundly changed with public housing being transferred to housing associations. So more broadly, in the past 2 decades, there's 4 dynamics that have been deepening housing inequalities I want to emphasize. First, there's been an increase in corporate build-to-rent properties, and these properties have been exempted from rent control, which was just recently passed. Second, private rents have increased 30% in just 3 years, from 2022 to 2025. Average private rent in Glasgow went from £963 to £1,250, so quite a dramatic increase. Third, the budgets to build affordable housing have been reduced by the Scottish Government by 25% in the most recent plan. And finally, areas undergoing renovation in Glasgow, up until recently, the mandate was to include 10% social housing. So there's been more weight towards private homeownership and mid-market rent. Next slide, please, Amelia. And so finally, this other last, through our research, we found a lot of unintended consequences of climate mitigation measures that have impacted inequalities. So just 2 to quickly highlight here before moving on to the opportunities. The first was we came across an Easter House, which is a housing estate built in the peripheries of Glasgow in the 1950s that rehoused people from the city centre that were living in poor quality tenement housing. So what happened here is that a local football pitch was converted into a rewilded field that provides flood mitigation for downstream, more affluent neighborhoods, and the local community wasn't sufficiently engaged in this process. And this is a problem because Easter House has been a stigmatized and marginalized neighborhood for decades, and they've had to fight to get basic services and infrastructures. So this local nonprofit manager that we spoke with talked about how this lack of recognition of the football pitch for local youth and the neighborhood raises distrust around local government action and also climate investments. Also, the second example in this Glasgow city centre, the low emission zone has been positive to reduce the emissions, but traffic has been rerouted to adjacent low income neighborhoods like the Gorbals, which is just across the Clyde River, where there's no fines related to the low emission zone. So this has meant that local communities are now fighting for parking, and also they see increased noise and air pollution. So just to underline the need to consider these unintended inequalities, like to consider resident engagement and the impacts beyond the boundaries of interventions. Last slide, Amelia, please. Thank you. So to close with these promising opportunities, it's in November 2023, Glasgow declared a housing emergency because of the severity of the housing crisis. And the Scottish government also declared a housing emergency in 2025. So this alongside the housing campaigners have pushed forward this Housing Scotland bill, which was adopted in September of last year. And this has updated rent controls which cap increases at the rate of inflation plus 1%. So this has been a really important achievement and really promising. Housing campaigners say it needs to go further because not all tenants are covered. So some forms of housing are excluded, mid-market rent and build-to-let homes are exempt. The second to highlight is this national planning framework, which is promising in that it includes spatial principles and policy tools related to just transition, compact growth, and rebalancing development in areas of past decline. So this includes that new housing development should have 25% affordable housing. In practice, though, we heard through our interviews that this can work against the profit priority of developers and investors, so it might make affordable housing difficult to produce in practice. So thank you for your attention, and passing it on to Lisa now about Nantes.
Thank you, Mel. Okay, so I will go on with our third and last case study, which we conducted in the city of Nantes in Western France. And much like the two speakers before me, I will follow a bit the same structure. So I thought I would mention the main types of inequality that we see in Nantes that are related also to the national regulation and structural inequality. And one main thing that was mentioned to us during the interviews and that we could also find in the literature is the rising precarization of workers and the rising rental and real estate costs, which have put a larger housing cost burden, especially on renters over the past 10 to 15 years, despite a slight decrease since the early 2020s, basically. So this has put a large pressure on the social housing market in all of France and specifically also in Nantes, leading to large waiting lists in order to enter social housing. Another problem or inequality that we see in all of France and maybe a little bit less in Nantes than in other larger cities in France are the so-called priority neighborhoods. So those are neighborhoods with large social housing estates that were constructed in the post-war period. And a lot of them are in quite bad condition now. So especially climatic conditions are quite bad in them. And they're also, since they're very often very spatially concentrated, a lot of the residents are lower income residents who benefit from social housing. And they also house a large racialized and migrant population. So this leads to kind of a stigmatization of these areas and its residents by extension. Another problem that is more specific to the city of Nantes and the Pays de la Loire region in basically south of Brittany are the large number of informal settlements. So in Nantes, around 2,500 to 3,000 people live in informal settlements across the metropolitan area. So we're in around 60 settlements, which is the largest number in all of France. In one metropolitan area, and most of the people who inhabit these settlements are Romanian Roma, and they suffer not only from environmental inequalities such as pollution or flooding, but also from economic and educational inequalities, segregation, and discrimination. So this is quite a large group, and that's important to think of when we think about Nantes. Some of the critical laws and policies that have shaped this climate housing nexus and transition policy in Nantes at the national level are the so-called SRU law, which is basically the law that structures social housing production in France until now, and it requires all municipalities of more than 10,000 inhabitants to construct at least 20% of social housing when they're or to get to at least 20% of social housing within their housing stock. Most of the municipalities haven't reached this goal. In the case of Nantes, the city of Nantes actually is almost at 20%, while the metropolitan area is still a little below. But in French comparison, they are quite one of the municipalities with one of the metropolises with quite a high share of social housing. Another important legislation compound, I would say, is the so-called national urban renewal programs. So they're basically the regulation and also the national funds that guide urban regeneration, especially in these so-called priority neighborhoods. So this is where most of the public money goes to renovate social housing, but also to change and adapt public spaces. For example, in the last couple of years, climate adaptation has played an increasing role in this funding. Then some of the laws guiding energy transition, so energy retrofits and climate adaptation in public spaces are the Energy Transition Law from 2015 and the Loi Énergie Climat from 2019. So they basically set aside funds to renovate both social housing and privately owned homes and also set a target to renovate all F and G rated housing units and even prohibited to rent out housing units that are rated lower than D. And then finally, one interesting law that was introduced in 2018 is the Loi Elan, which basically gave municipalities the right to implement rent control for the first time, kind of an experimental regulation. The city of Nantes has applied for this. The metropolitan area, has applied for this law in 2025, but no specific action has been taken yet. So rents are not controlled yet in the metropolitan area. Next slide, please, Emilia. Thank you. Much like Melissa and Emilia, I will go over the main manifestations of inequality that we found in our research in Nantes. And I think what's interesting to mention is that these kind of stem from the interaction of the structural inequalities that Emilia mentioned at the beginning, and I mentioned now specifically for Nantes, kind of the interaction with the transition policies and the policies that are ongoing in the city. So one of the main things that a lot of the interviewers mentioned, and we can see very clearly in this quote of an official from the Parks Department, is the cost, what he called the cost of attractivity. So basically, the fact that the city of Nantes has put a lot of effort and money, public money, also into creating new green infrastructure, into making public transport more available throughout the city, which has had a significantly positive impact on the availability of green space, for example, but also how more relegated peripheral areas are connected to the city center. But this has, of course, had a strong impact on housing and rental prices, which have strongly increased over the past 10 to 15 years, and which have created a form of exclusion, just the fact that some people can't afford to live in the city center anymore. And this is also what this interviewer from the Parks Department mentioned. And we can see below here some images of the projects that have been conducted in Nantes. One of them is this, what is called the Jardin Extraordinaire. So basically a public park with some like touristic infrastructure, which has been criticized for kind of putting more attractivity into the city center and creating more pressure on the rental and housing market. Next slide, please. Another aspect that came up a lot during our research in Nantes is this aspect of urban renewal that I touched upon before. So basically, whenever national funds come into a city to promote this urban regeneration, mainly of neighborhoods that already have a lot of social housing, so the retrofitting, sometimes also the demolition of social housing buildings and the reconstruction in most cases. They also come with some regulations, basically, namely what is called social mixing. So the idea to kind of displace lower income social tenants and get in middle income or even sometimes also private owners of houses. So social housing is the aim is to disperse social housing, basically. And as this administrative person at a local social landlord argued, while it's not a goal of the social landlords to make tenants leave, since it's the goal to what they call rebalance or diversify the area, this necessarily implies that lower income residents are displaced from their neighborhoods and they're not able to benefit from their social networks anymore. They're kind of taken out of their neighborhoods, which is of course a very distressing impact on them. Next slide. Thank you. And last but not least, especially when talking about these what is called priority neighborhoods, so neighborhoods with a lot of social housing and lower income residents, is the stigmatization of these areas, which has kind of led to increased securitization and policing, especially in public spaces, and sometimes even leads to decisions like architectural decisions being made in order to facilitate the policing of these areas. So, for example, not planting trees in an area to be able to create a clear path to survey a space, for example. But it also makes difficult, the stigmatization also makes difficult the production of public-private, so basically of attracting funding to construct more housing in these areas, because as this person from a neighborhood nonprofit argues, people don't want to move into these areas. So it's difficult to attract investment in order to construct more housing. Next slide, please. So about the promising opportunities in Nantes, I think there's quite a lot of we can see a real effort of the municipal and metropolitan government to push more affordable and social housing. So we can see this on the one hand in the local housing plan, but also in a recent what they call plan de relance. So basically more public money is invested into relaunching the local housing market. And the goal is to produce at least 33% of social housing within new constructions. So overall, their aim is to produce 6,000 units per year. These goals weren't reached in the past few years, but that's why this plan de relance was launched, I think, 2 years ago. So there's really a lot of public commitment and funds also to come with this commitment to affordable housing. Another aspect that I mentioned in the beginning was the informal settlements in the metropolitan area. So while a lot of the interviewers criticized the municipal handling and metropolitan handling of the settlements in the last 2 years, there's been a large amount of public funds set aside in order to basically public tender to find community organizations that kind of propose ideas how to basically relocate the residents into housing situations that are both adapted to their needs, but also safer in terms of environmental pollution and kind of not as relegated as the settlements before. There's also a lot more cooperation with local associations. So we can see, for example, on the bottom left, a documentary that was filmed by a local association called Café Brod, and they produced, before the regeneration of the Bellevue neighborhood, a priority neighborhood in Nantes, they co-produced with the residents a documentary kind of trying to capture the spirit of the neighborhood and the meaning of the places that were going to be demolished. And another interesting idea that was pushed forward by the Parks Department in Nantes are publicly managed gardens, which produce fresh vegetables and fruit for low-income residents. So they're basically managed by the Parks Department. And then the produce is given to local associations to distribute between lower-income residents, especially in priority neighborhoods. So I think these actions show an effort to relieve the rising precarity and structural inequalities that I talked about in the beginning, and show kind of a growing recognition of the injustices suffered by, especially by lower income residents in the area. Maybe to sum up, I think what we can see from the comparison of these 3 cities is that there's a lot of challenges that, even though the cities are very different, there's a lot of challenges that kind of stem from similar structural inequalities, which is the financialization of housing. Basically, renters are struggling to keep up with that rising cost of living, and how the transition policies can inadvertently kind of come into this climate housing nexus and accelerate, for example, inaffordability as we see in very clearly in Barcelona and Nantes, for example. But I think we can also see that as a promising opportunity that across Europe, in many cities, there are also really advanced and progressive policies that are being implemented. There's a lot of activism, as we saw in Glasgow, for example, that is kind of trying to push for more climate justice. And we can see that at the municipal scale, it's and some of these things are also being implemented, some of these ideas. So I think this can give us some hope for the future.
Super. I think just to kind of close it up, we also do offer some other toolkits that I think cover some of the same topics, a little bit more towards the global north as a whole, with focus as well on North America. Here are just a selection of them. We also wrote this policy and planning toolkit for urban green justice on the top left, which covers both the implementation of urban greening, but also the protection and support of housing and remaining in housing. Also, just again, some of our other partners that have thought about the same ideas that I think would be good resources for practitioners. And I think just to close it out, here are our contacts. We would be super supportive of hearing from you more directly if that's of interest. And please do find the report in, I think, a link in the chat. And we would be welcome to questions, Q&A.
Thanks so much to all of you, Amelia, Melissa, and Lisa, for such an insightful set of presentations that highlight both the structural inequalities in cities in the built environment, and specifically around housing, the mechanisms, the juridical mechanisms that have led or exacerbated that those structural inequalities, how they're manifesting in each of the 3 cities, and what the promising opportunities look like that practitioners can take away as inspiration for modifying their approach to policymaking as they're working to tackle both direct emissions and embodied emissions, making sure that those policies, as you mentioned, are not further exacerbating existing structural inequalities, but can actually be solutions to both redress existing and historic inequality, and at the same time protect communities from future climate impacts. So thank you very much. We have some time for questions. We have about 12, 13 minutes left. So please don't be shy. Feel free to raise your hand or unmute and direct questions at any of our presenters today.
Anyone's also welcome to write in the chat if you have any questions as well. But yeah, feel free to unmute and jump in.
And in addition to any questions, please share any observations from your local context that you want to share for people. In the chat, I will read this out loud for everyone. I think this work would be an interesting contribution to the affordable housing plan in EU cities such as Barcelona and Nantes. Regarding questions in these cities, is there any support program that helps people carry out renovations, or has there been any alignment with the transposition of current policies such as the EPBD or ETS2?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Isla. I'm assuming this refers to housing renovations. In the Barcelona context, I've done a lot of research on this recently, actually. There's been a lot of funding from the Recovery and Resilience Facility. So this was the post-COVID recovery funds. So there's about 3.4 billion euros that went to Spain for housing retrofits. And there's a specific program within that funding line that goes to neighborhood. So it's distributed nationally, then it's regionally, and then each region, because they have competency over housing, then distributes it further. But there is a pot of money that's specifically for neighborhood level interventions. And so this is defined by, like, for example, the Barcelona metropolitan area has done an excellent job of developing a program to support low-income communities to retrofit like large building blocks, basically the cladding of the building, the windows, the roofs, to improve energy efficiency by about at least 45%. So this is the funding was from 2001, 2002, and it's just finished now. So the interventions are finishing up this year. So this is all kind of in process, but that's been the main program, and that was really facilitated from this EU funding that came in. I'm not sure in Nantes. So yeah, again, this is with the Energy Performance Building Directive. This is all connected to the EU level objectives. Yeah.
For France, maybe I can go ahead. There's a large amount. This was connected to the first. I'm not sure if it's the first, but the main energy climate law in 2015, and there was basically a national funds made available for both the renovation of social housing, because there's such a large social housing stock which is poorly or in the process of being renovated because it was very poorly isolated. And so these are mainly national funds. And then there's for the renovation of social housing, and then there's another budget which basically is offered kind of a subsidy offered to private homeowners, which is called Ma Prime Rénov', and it's basically also a national fund for which you can apply as an individual if you own your home in order to facilitate renovation. And then there's another also nationally coordinated initiative which is supposed to facilitate the renovation of buildings where there's more than one owner. So it's basically agencies that kind of help these co-owned buildings coordinate renovation, which mainly in cities where there's not so many single family homes. They're trying to kind of make it easier for co-owners to coordinate, I don't know, replacing the roof, for example, financially, but also just in terms of organization. So there's local, regional agencies for this in every region, and it's all funded nationally, to my knowledge.
I had a question for you. For the example where the low emission zone has adverse impacts to neighboring neighborhoods around traffic, noise, and air pollution, what are you seeing actions cities are taking to mitigate those community impacts just outside the low emission zone?
I think when I had talked with that nonprofit manager who brought that to our attention, I think that was kind of a developing story that he was hearing from folks. So I'm not exactly sure, and I should follow up with him about, how has Glasgow, the council, continued to address that. But I certainly do think that there are lots of opportunities, and I mean, I think of like some of the previous research that we've done as a lab in other European cities and North American cities that are trying to address both that the housing and the greening, the urban greening, the unintended effects. I think a lot of that again can be found in our 2021 policy toolkit that I had mentioned earlier. But another example too is, of course, in Barcelona, the super block. I mean, that was always the major complaint, or one of the major kind of arguments from neighborhood residents was that by redirecting traffic, it was just putting that traffic into like the outer periphery roadways. And I think in terms of Barcelona, I think a lot of that has been addressed also because they've implemented at such a large scale that now across the city that there's all this redirection of traffic. And so I think the pilot project can, of course, have these issues, but then when we get it to the scale at which we need it for an entire city, perhaps there is where we really see the larger benefits. I don't know, Melissa, if you know more on that, on maybe what Barcelona did there.
Yeah, no, I was going to jump in more to say I think like the fundamental, I mean, I agree exactly what you say, Amelia, but there's also this fundamental question about car use, that's like, is the more foundational question, and then having very, very good public transit that people can get places they need to go. And I think in the Glasgow situation, this is like probably the bigger issue than, for example, in Barcelona, which has quite good interconnected transport networks. But I think also the way that the superblocks they addressed this was by doing these green axis, this Eschbert. So instead of having the 3x3 block, they decided to extend the street all the way across the Eixample as a way to, because of the, yeah, I'm not sure, the argument is also in terms of equity. This will be more equitable the more we can expand it across the city, but it's still, yeah, I think it's still unclear in that sense. But in the Glasgow case, I would say, Tracy, I mean, I think it's been in effect only a few years, the low emission zone. But I think in the Glasgow case, there's a larger question about transportation access and, networks that people can use that they can depend on to get around the city and go to work, go home, that sort of thing.
Which is also certainly, we talk about this in the report in chapter 5, is our calls for policy change. And something that we directly heard from particularly housing activists who are now moving into this kind of economic justice space is that currently in Glasgow, it's rather like islands of transportation where it's very difficult to get from one neighborhood to another using public transportation, public transit. And so the housing tenants are moving into that space, which I think is really indicative of it's not just about housing, it's not just about climate, it's just not just about economy, but these three things are really overlapped and interwoven, and we have to address all of them in order to more equitable outcomes.
We have another question in the chat. Thank you for that, by the way. We have another question in the chat that speaking about green development and that it drives up costs and can push existing residents out of the area. Have you also looked at how this affects citizens' attitudes towards climate action? What a great question. Are people becoming more skeptical or disengaged when they see these projects transforming their neighborhoods in ways that don't benefit them?
Yeah, I mean, I think again, thinking towards the Glasgow case, I think that would probably certainly be yes, that people are more skeptical or unsure about what's going to happen next, and particularly again in Glasgow that when COP 20 when COP came, and I think so much of that was directed towards this national spectacle. I think there was an overwhelming feeling that folks did not feel like it was towards them, and particularly as we spoke to activists, there's a lot of anger there, but I think that also translates into action in some ways. So perhaps it's not inaction, but rather towards more action, which I think many folks are very willing and supportive to be working with local governments and regional governments in order to try to produce outcomes from that action.
Maybe I can add, I feel like it's not. I feel like it's a bit similar in Nantes, maybe not so much the fact, I feel like a lot of people feel like it's not what you just mentioned, Emilia, it's not for them. So there's kind of some climate action happening, but it's not directed at specific groups, particularly in the case of Nantes, the residents of the priority neighborhoods or lower income residents in general or unhoused populations. So it's kind of this feeling of like a two-scale green development, let's say, and that a lot of the things are, sound great on paper and they're like really attractive. And even if they're well intended, they don't actually have the impacts they're supposed to have on precarious populations.
Just the one last comment on this. I think it's an excellent question. And I think what I find really concerning is how the far right has been tapping into this feeling of people being told what to do. Maybe you've heard about this, like the 15-minute city turned into this thing of like, they're trying to control where I'm moving. It's like, no, it's about making things accessible when we move on foot, on cycling, But I think this happened in Barcelona with the low emission zone, is that the far right said, oh, they're controlling how you're going to drive your car, and where you can go and how you can move. And so, yeah, it's being mobilized as like an attack against individuality. And for people that are, this resonates with people. So I think this is like something that is a big concern that was why it needs to be taken very seriously. yeah, engaging people in these processes and showing how we, why this is important, and yeah.
And Isleen added a comment about how important it is for us to learn from each other and the mistakes, so that as we take these actions, we're building support because we're making more fair approaches to climate action, and how learning from each other is really critical to that, and understanding where these inequities are being exacerbated. So.
I can add that we've been having this conversation across the CNCA network for several years now, how to really make climate action work for people. You all have talked about it here, how to bring down energy costs, how to create comfort, how to address food insecurity, how to address community cohesiveness. I think there's really a strong understanding and conviction at this point that climate needs to really drive community benefits first and foremost. Otherwise, we can't really expect communities, especially priority communities, to jump on board and to really be champions, become climate champions themselves. So very, very relevant. Thank you all for such insightful comments and observations, considerations, and for the volume of work. It's truly incredibly timely and important. I think I would end on one consideration, that while this report focuses on the European context, particularly three countries and three particular city case dives, I think what's really interesting is how relevant this conversation is across all of the geographies where CNCA is present. We have cities in the US, Canada, Australia, and beyond, who are having these very same conversations, struggling with the very same challenges, and I think we see that this is the learning that we just highlighted. The need to learn from one another is essentially the main mission of CNCA, is to help cities who are striving for real leadership in the climate space make those leaps together and have those difficult conversations together across geographies, and bringing insights and successes and approaches across different geographies. So thank you all so much. Thank you to the entire research team, and thank you to our supporters who have included. I saw Mel Beeston had from the Lattice Foundation had signed up earlier in the conversation, and I recognize Catherine Wright from the Barr Foundation, who supported our work in North America, but all of our philanthropic partners who make this work possible. So thank you all so much, and thank you to the participants for joining us, and we'll see you next time.